because his granddaughter, I don't know how much touched up, but what I'm saying is, his granddaughter, Mary Elizabeth Gladney, my great-great-grandmother, never lost her red hair. She lived to be in her 80s.
But his beard is white.
First of Samuel's children, born
Her
in
hair's
heaven,
dark.
Joseph, James,
My
Thomas,
grandmother's
Richard,
sister
Hugh.
died almost 90 years old and then hair.
I think Richard right there. Let's go back and look
Your
and see.
grandmother's
Did I have that right?
Grandmother's
Tony,
sister-in-law,
he remembers better.
sister-in-law, yeah.
what?
Married here in Georgia and Alabama, right near here. And how many years each of them lived. I was doing it for a certain project for my granddaughter. And then I averaged them all out. I was supposed to die last year.
Oh, man.
That's ridiculous.
Yeah.
This is my great-great-grandfather.
Back to David. Yeah, the next number 2. The next one. So, she's about 2 years younger than Sandra.
Really?
So we had lunch there. Okay, they have still.
You just tested me once. You know that? You just tested me. Just a 3.
Wow. Okay. And the next one. Okay.
That stuff's not real.
She told me, she said, that stuff's not real.
Well, that shows her ignorance.
My mom said 5.
Born in 1970, and she married.
Split up.
Because he's young, that's why.
Yeah, young man.
He got married.
So we're just gonna stay cash.
He's always good thing.
Are you gonna be able to get in here in the morning, 9:30?
Oh, I got the mirror.
This week, do the one for me. You're or if you go by the motel.
One out of 4.
No, I think they're all
You've been there, right?
This is the beginning of the cemetery tour. This is my father, Butch Adams, who died in 2006. His father is buried diagonally to him. That's Horace and Minnie Worley Adams. And then this is a Gladney descendant. His name was Tawny Alvin Adams. He was the son of Mary Elizabeth Gladney Adams. And they had Lenny, Looney, Lonnie, Tawny, Johnny, and Bertie.
Oh my
And-
God.
Do that again.
Yes.
Say that
You call
again.
one, everybody came.
They had their children after my great-great-grandfather had married the first time, and his first wife died in childbirth, and after he married my great-great-grandmother, they had Lenny, Looney, Lonnie, Tawny, and Johnny, and then they had twin daughters, and they named them Viola Berta and Iola Roberta. And Iola Roberta died in infancy, and Aunt Bertie is buried in this grave here with the yellow flowers. Her name was Berta, and she married a Vaughn. Now, her brother Johnny is buried over here on this side, and he also married a Vaughn. And there was a sister and a brother married a brother and a sister. And that happened a lot in the Gladney and Adams families, and the Hyatts too. You didn't get out much, and so you were local to whoever you were local to. So we'll go ahead and walk down. Now, Butch's brother, Barry, is buried. He has a military marker where that little bouquet of flowers is.
Were they both, are they both dead, Barry?
No, Harry's alive. This is John Hubert Jackson and Lucille Merle Jackson. These are Alan Jackson's grandparents.
Oh, I thought that was them.
No,
I told
this is
everybody.
Alan's grandparents.
Well, that one looks fancier, doesn't it?
Yes, and you would think that Alan would put flowers, but he never does.
He doesn't even put them on his father's. His mother does.
And this is his great uncle and great aunt and cousin.
It's very rare he comes, but she has her house now so that he can drive his bus to the back and nobody knows when he's there. He built that big garage back there to put that bus in.
And just below this, you can't see the name on it because it's on the front, but that is Aunt's and Maudie Mae Adams. Aunt's Adams was Tawny Adams' first cousin. Aunt's Adams' mother was a lady named Susie Gladney. Her full name was Susanna R., but they always called her Susie, and she's buried on the front side. We'll see that grave shortly. But he has several descendants buried here. You'll see the blank spot in the middle. Those two graves below the blank spot are all his descendants. The top grave is Ronnie Adams and Cheryl Adams, two of his sons, and the grave below is of his daughter, Barbara Jean Adams McCown, and his grandson, James Mapp. His mother was a lady named Ninner Spradlin, and that grave is next to it. You can't see the top, barely see the top of it. Her name was Ninner Spradlin. She married Anari Spradlin, but her first husband, Mr. Mapp, was killed, shot dead, whenever Charles was just little. And so what happened is Charles Mapp basically became a brother to all of the other children because he was so young. And he and Ronnie basically grew up together, and that's why they wanted to be buried close to one another.
What's those ants right there? Stay right here.
We'll come over here and you'll see the red stone. That is Miss Ruby Hyatt Duke. That is Melba Templeton's sister. Her parents were Eunice and Herman, Eunice Gladney and Herman Hyatt. And we'll see their grave shortly. But that's where she was buried. She was in the Women's Army Air Corps in World War II. The grave next to the Duke is Miss Nina Bussey, and Miss Nina Bussey was an Adams, and she was Aunt Adams' daughter. And she married James Bussey, and the Busseys are also buried on the front side. And we have one more grave to point out. This Adams here is Johnny Adams, the aforementioned Johnny Adams who married Pauline Vaughn. And you'll also see Vaughns and Shellnuts and Nuts. They're all related to one another. All of the Central Hatchie families kind of tie in one way or another at some point. Now we're not going to go to the lower side, but down on the lower side there are some Gladney descendants. The black stone, there are two black stones. The stone on the right that says Dean That is Mr. Bobby Dean. His wife, Jane, was an Adams and was Miss Nina Bussey's sister. And so they were both daughters of Vance Adams. He's buried down there. And on the lot in front, you'll see that there is a stone, and there's also a baby grave in the same lot. That is Donald Adams and his son, Donnie Wayne. Donald Adams was a son of Earl Adams, who was a son of Eck. Eck Adams and Nance Adams were brothers. So those are Gladney descendants also. But we're going to stay on this upper side. And this is Herman and Eunice Gladney Hyatt. That is Melba. These are Melba's mother and daddy, and there are also stones in memory of Bruce, who died in 2012, and Bernice Lemons, who died in 2009. And they also had a younger brother, Billy Jim, who died when he was young. And this is Eunice Gladney Hyatt was the daughter of Zach Gladney, and Zach Gladney is buried at Primitive Baptist Church about 1.5 miles from here north. And Herman Hyatt, we'll be talking more about the Hyatts shortly, because 3 of the Hyatts married into the Gladney family. They were all Adamses or Gladneys. And Herman was one of the brothers of that Hyatt group. The grave, this 2 lots back.
Sorry.
In the Gladneys of America book, there is a man mentioned by the name of Mr. Bob Gladney. This is where he's buried. He was the son of Lemuel and Frances Gladney, and their son Thomas Gladney is also buried here. He died when he was he died much younger than some of the other Gladneys, but he died and he was married to an Ora Williamson. And Sue is their granddaughter. Would you like to say anything about your grandfather?
Well, everybody called him Uncle Bob, and my grandmother here was more or less was a midwife. We had a doctor in the community, but my grandmother delivered a lot of the babies, because I think the ladies were so, whatever you want to say, they didn't want that right. But
They lived that little road you see right down there, the little gravel road. They lived right behind these trees for 60-something years. And Sue and I have a place there and have a garden there now.
Tanya, would this be a Martha Ann Gladney? What is her? Was it Martha A?
She was
Martha Ann Gladney, and she was
Martha Adam? Martha Ann?
Martha Ann. Mhm. She was Archer, but she was Martha Ann Gladney. Probably Archer, but she was Martha Ann. That she was called Maddie, and they had one other child that was buried in Heard County across the river that died as a baby. That was their Bispin. But they were very well liked, and my grandmother was a good cook, and everybody liked a lot of the nieces and nephews of the Jim Gladney and all of the others that always came to their house a lot, even after my dad died. And
Was Robert Lee and Martha married? Is that the ones that husband and wife?
Mm-hmm. And William Thomas and Aura. Just got
So
Thomas.
these were brothers, right?
No.
Robert,
Mother and daddy and son and his wife.
Oh, I got you. Okay. Yes, I didn't see the dates. Yeah. I'm not there.
Okay, here in the middle, those are Adele Nutt Garrett and Philip J. Nutt. They were the children of Emma H. Nutt, Emma H. Gladney, who married John Arch Nutt, and we'll be seeing their grave across the road shortly. But that is where, those are 2 more Gladney descendants. And I believe that's all the Gladney descendants on this side of the street. We'll kind of move over to the other side. Now, we're not going to go down this far, but on this side of the road, we also have Eunice and Herman's son, Reese Hyatt, is buried on this side of the road with his son, Joseph. and they also have a grandson, TJ, who was tragically killed in an auto accident back in 2003. 2002. They're buried on the lower level, down almost to the road. In addition, we also have the Nut over here on this side. That is R.M. Nutt Jr. His mother was named Martha Florence Gladney, and they only had, she and her husband, R.M. Nutt, had 2 children that survived, and one is buried here, R.M. Jr. And they also had a daughter, Elva, and she's buried farther west of here at a cemetery called Union Grove. And that's where she's buried. But he's buried here.
Tony, did you know that Uncle Marvin used to have a back shot swing back in the corner?
I think I did.
I don't know if you knew that or not.
Now we're going to go into what we call the old section of the cemetery. And we believe that, or I believe that the oldest grave in our cemetery dates back to about 1860. And the reason is because a Sarah Ely, who died in 1860 according to the church minutes, is the earliest documented grave that we can find in the cemetery. And oddly enough, she is an ancestor of some of the Gladney cousins. Their descendant, Loney Estelle Ely, married Looney Adams, and we will be finding their grave shortly. R.M. Vaughn and S.E.A. Vaughn. R.M. Vaughn and S.E.A. Vaughn were Alan Jackson's great-great-grandparents, or great-grandparents. But anyway, they're his ancestors also. And Sarah Elizabeth Ann Vaughn was a Hollingsworth, and where we were at Plant Wansley earlier used to be where the Hollingsworth Ferry was. And that was one of the few crossing points on the Chattahoochee in this area until the bridge was built.
Did you know that's where Alan Jackson's mother grew up?
I didn't know that.
Yellow Brick.
Yellow Dirt. That's down there where the plant was, wasn't
In that area down there, Alan's from there. And she was a music.
And I've been across that Hollingsworth Ferry when I was little. I only stop here for a moment just to reflect on the fact that when you go through cemeteries, cemeteries are living history, to pardon the pun. But if you'll notice, James Pickens Norwood and Leona Abel Norwood, if you'll notice the death dates, they died 5 days apart. And they were victims of the 1918 influenza epidemic. They died 5 days apart.
it? Killed 20,000 people in the South.
A lot of people died. But they were victims of the influenza epidemic.
Wow.
And here in this area here, we have quite a few Gladney and Hyatt relations. Here we have Harvey and Ethel Hyatt. Ethel was an Adams. Ethel's father was Eck Adams and would have been a first cousin to Tawny and to Anse Adams. Well, actually, she would have been Ance's niece, excuse me. Harvey's parents were Viola and Henry Hyatt, and she was a Strickland, and their grave is there. And 3 of their children married into the Gladney relations. Their son Herman married Eunice Gladney. Their daughter Mary married Tawny Adams, that was my great-grandparents. And then Harvey married Ethel, and they were all related to one another. The grave next to it here, the Adams, that is Earl Adams. I mentioned to you a while ago that he was the father of Donald Adams, and Earl and Ethel were brother and sister. The Harcrow in behind, that is also a Gladney descendant. John R. Harcrow, we always called him Riley Harcrow, was the son of Annie Maud Harcrow and Johnny Harcrow. And Annie Maud was a shell nut, but her mother was Lula Gladney
Shellnut, and Lula was another one of Lemuel's children.
And
So-
they lived right here.
And lived right up here. Then the grave in front of that is another brother of the Hythes. That was one of Herman's brothers, Hoyt, and his family. This is Annie Maud Harcrow. This is Riley's mother and daddy, Johnny Harcrow and Annie Maud. And Annie Maud had 3 children. She had Riley, she had Fred, and she had another daughter they named Alzarine. And Alzarine is now deceased. This lot here, this is Etta V. Norwood and her husband, Duvard, and their son, James E. Etta V. Norwood was Etta V. Adams. And Etta V. Adams was a sister of Ethel and also sister of Earl. Their son, James E. Norwood, was a race car enthusiast and was killed, and he might very well have made NASCAR if he had lived, but he was killed in an auto racing accident in Florida in 1963.
Edward.
Yeah, I believe they could call him Edward.
Mhm.
This is Rachel Ashmore Raymont, and she was the daughter of Ralph Ashmore and Ira. And Ira was another Shellnut. She was the daughter of Lula and George Jefferson Shellnut, and that is their grave. And they also had Thomas Lemuel being named after Lemuel Gladney. And that's their lot. That's where George Shellnut and Lula Gladney Shellnut are buried. We'll move on. Please watch your step. Don't walk in a lot, because we have one that's already sinking.
It's already what?
It's sinking.
Oh, yeah. No, I see that.
We have 18 Civil War veterans buried in the cemetery. We actually have 2 Civil War veterans who died during the war. They were sent home to get well, and they died at home. One of them is William F. Levins, and the other is John Britton Akins. And they're not related to the Gladneys, but it's an interesting tidbit of historical info that we actually have 2 Civil War soldiers who died during the war that are buried here. In addition, according to family lore, we have a Mr. Shirey that was buried here by his brother, according to family information, but we don't know where that grave is.
Oh, yeah, I see those 2 crypts over there.
I was mentioning,
yeah.
the one in the back is Sarah Ely, and that's
Okay.
the oldest grave that we know of in the cemetery.
Okay.
In fact, I believe that this entire corner here was the first part buried in, because William F. Levins died in 1863, and Samuel Ely died in the 1860s also. So we believe that this is the oldest corner of the cemetery before they started spreading it out from here. And we'll do Brainerd next.
Look at all tall. Mercy gracious.
Now, I mentioned earlier that James Kennard Adams had married a lady before, and her name was Molly Vaughn. This is her grave. She died in childbirth with her second son, and they named him A-I-R-O-N, but they pronounced it Iron. So you had Byron and Iron. Then you had Lenny, Looney, Lonnie, Tawny, Johnny, and Bertie. Go figure.
Okay.
These 2 graves are of 2 of the children of Johnny Adams. This is Carl Adams and Novell, and they were 2 of his young children that died before they were very old. Here we have some infant children of Serena Shirey, who was also a Gladney descendant. And behind there you'll see the Adams. That is Susie Gladney Adams and her husband Brainerd. And then Brainerd's second wife, he married Segby Buttram after Susie died in 1901, or 1902, excuse me. And they had 6 children. They had Eck, and Nance, and Laura, and Naomi, and Serena, and Italy. And we're going to discuss Italy shortly. And earlier we saw the graves of Adele Nutt and Philip Nutt. This is Emma Gladney Nutt and her husband John Arch Nutt, and that's a Gladney descendant. After Emma died in 1931, John Arch Nutt remarried, and he married a lady named Josie Thompson Spruill, and they had 1 daughter. And Josie Thompson Spruill had a large family with Mr. Zachariah Spruill. And Mr. Lewis Spruill, who owned Spruill Oil Company in Carrollton, was one of their sons. And so he knew John Arch Nutt as his stepfather for many years after, for several years after he and his mother got married. Now we come to one of the more seedy stories that I want to tell today. You'll notice the death dates on Robert T. and Etta Lee McWhirter. Etta Lee died March 7th, 1928. Robert T. died March 9th, 1928. There's a reason for that. There's also a reason why they're not buried by one another. They had a baby who died. They had a young baby who died when he was a child. He died in 1924, and so they buried them on either side. But the main reason why they're buried on either side. So the story goes, and you can actually read it in the newspaper in 1928. Robert found out the possibility that Etta Lee had been cheating on him, and he even found her letters. Well, that passed over briefly, and apparently something had happened, and it boiled over in his soul so much so that one day after eating breakfast, he went after her with a kitchen knife and cut her, but he didn't kill her. She escaped him and ran halfway across Noonan. He chased her and finally caught up with her near the railroad tracks and shot her point blank dead with a shotgun. Well, in his agony over having done that, he turned the gun on himself, and when he pulled the trigger, apparently, it blew out this part of his side, and he didn't die immediately. It took him a day and a half to die. And so whenever they buried them on either side of the baby rather than burying them side by side because of what happened. And
Where
finally,
did you learn all of this?
Sir?
Where did you learn all this history?
You study as you go. You study as you go. Now, before we point out Lemuel and Francis, I will say also that there is one more. Their oldest son, John Gladney, that's the oldest son of Lemuel and Francis Gladney, is buried behind the Nutt. And John Gladney got his name from the grandfathers, John Anderson Gladney. Well, John Gladney was Lemuel's father, and Anderson Knight was Francis's father, and so they named him John Anderson Gladney. Their next child, Mary Elizabeth Gladney, was named after the grandmothers, named after Mary Ann Russell Gladney and Elizabeth Addison Knight. And so the first 2 children their names were taken from the grandparents. And these graves here are of Lemuel Gladney and Francis Gladney. Lemuel was born in 1833 and died in 1918, and Francis was born in 1843 and died in 1927. And there's actually a very interesting story about Francis's ancestry. Francis is descended from the Carrington family of Carroll County, who can be traced back to the Carrington families of Virginia. And if you believe Greg Carson on the internet, which I find his information to be somewhat plausible, there's a possibility that Francis's ancestors had sugar plantations on Barbados. Whether it's true or not, we don't know because we can't prove it at this point. Now there are a couple more graves we'll see before we finish. I mentioned Looney Adams a while ago, and this is Uncle Looney and Aunt Loney. Looney Adams married Loney Ely, which kind of gets a little funny because Looney had a brother named Lonnie. So there was Uncle Looney, Uncle Lonnie, and Aunt Loney. And that's where they're buried. And Uncle Looney died in 32, so and he died with his children being young, his oldest daughter got married soon after he died. And oddly enough, she married a Hyatt. Okay, then finally, we'll go see my great-great-grandparent Adams's grave, which she was a Gladney. This is Eck Adams and his wife, Ida McWhirter. And Ida was a sister of Robert who shot his wife. So we had a brother and a sister married sister and brother one more time. Ida McWhirter and Robert McWhirter were brother and sister. And then Eck Adams and Etta Lee Adams were brother and sister. And then now we will look at... These are three of Berta Adams Vaughn's children, Doyle, Rayburn, and Donald. And then finally, these are my great-great-grandparents, James Kennard Adams and Mary Elizabeth Gladney Adams. And the dates on these tombstones are incorrect. James Kennard was born in 1862. And Mary Gladney Adams was also born in 1862, so these dates, for whatever reason, are incorrect. If you look off into the distance, you'll see an Adams. That Adams is the half-brother, so he's not a Gladney, but he is the first son of James Kennard Adams. His name was Byron, and he married a Vaughn. He married a Thornton, who was also descended from the Vaughns. And the Coleman grave and the heart-shaped grave on the very corner, those are two daughters also of Berta Adams Vaughn. Adele Vaughn married J. Chapman, and he's buried at Caney Head. And Ermidale Coleman had a huge family. She had, I believe, 12 children. She had 1 by Whitley and 11 by Coleman, and that's where she is buried, on the very corner. And that will bring a close to the cemetery tour.
Did you?
Anybody have a question?
What about Jim Gladney and Ezra Gladney?
Oh, there. We missed Ezra. We sure did. We gotta go farther back this way. I'm sorry, this is not over. Excuse me. This is James Calvin Gladney and ex-supporter Gladney, and their son Ezra Gladney is buried beside them with his wife Lydia Nutt. She was a Nutt also. Ezra Gladney was the sheriff of Heard County for 6 years back in the 1940s. And what happened is, and I'll probably tell this again at the jail, but in 1942, the current sheriff, Mr. Goodson, discovered that you could make more money being a security guard at the mill than he was making as sheriff. And so he resigned being sheriff to go work in the mill. When he resigned, the coroner at the time appointed Lonnie Adams, who was the police chief of Franklin at the time, to stay in the jail long enough for them to have a special election. So Uncle Lonnie stayed in the jail for about a month and a half. And when they had the election, Ezra Gladney was the only candidate, and so he won by default. And he was sheriff for 6 years. And then he was defeated in election by Virgil Bledsoe, and Virgil was the sheriff for 30 years in Heard County after that.
And Jim Gladney lives right over here. Right.
Yes.
Not in that house, but the one just past that one. You can see that.
Virgil's daddy was
The sheriff.
sheriff before that.
And Charlie Bledsoe was
And
the
he
sheriff.
was my
first.
uncle, and Virgil was my cousin.
That's
And Ezra was my daddy's cousin, and Bledsoe was my mother's cousin.
awesome.
So when they went to vote on the way, my dad looked over and he said, "Now you're gonna vote the right way." And she said, "I sure am." She said, "You and your cousins had it long enough. Me and my cousins." But I don't know how she really voted too. They were kidding.
All right. Anybody else have a question? That concludes the cemetery tour.
That was about as awesome as I'd ever heard one young man speak with memory about anything gracious.
And
Really
it's
good.
2:15, so let's go ahead and go to the cars because we need to go ahead and go on to the museum. It's going to be hot in the jail when we go upstairs.
There's a hole in them there. Just trying to make sure that they they were in control of everything. I think they had a all black.
Never used the gallows.
They were free.
This is Miss Sharon Frost, and she is one of the museum coordinators, and she is a Gladney descendant. And I'm going to let her introduce herself and tell you a little about the building.
Alrighty, I am Sharon Frost. I am the granddaughter of Lonnie Adams, and some of you may know or heard of him. And he was married to Josie Favor. This building was built in 1912. There's some pictures here of it being built, and of course there's some upstairs. And this building in 1912, the roof caught on fire because they didn't have any heat to speak of upstairs. And so the prisoners were allowed to build fires in their little chamber pots. And when they did, guess what happened?
How about that?
Fire
Oh my God.
to the roof. So they had to redo the roof. But anyway, they got that fixed. And during that time period, the prisoners were moved to Newnan and Atlanta, and then, of course, they were brought back here. This room here, when you go in here, this was the living room where they did some entertaining. This room here was the sheriff and his wife's bedroom. Obviously, this was the little hallway. And when we get back here to this other room, this was the kitchen. Some of you may have been in this building before, maybe several years ago, maybe when Virgil was here, Mr. Gladney was here, maybe when Lonnie Adams was here. How many of you have been here before when Virgil was here?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, I was here.
And Sue, would you like to say anything about?
I spent the night here.
Now, she's done more than I have. I used to play here. I used to play here on in here in the house. Of course, the family was separated from the prisoners upstairs, and when you get to the other room, you'll see that the prisoners didn't come in here. They came into a room over there, and then they were immediately escorted upstairs. So it was like, you know, two different entities here. What else do I know? Oh, of course, the jail is upstairs, and Tony's going to take you upstairs and talk to you about that. Okay, we've turned this room into a research room and the other room into an office. Sue, would you like to say anything about any stories about the jail?
Well, I do have one story that Wilma Gladney was Ezra's daughter that was my age, and I used to spend some time here with her, and then she would come to my house. And in the afternoons, they would let us go upstairs and get money from the prisoners to go get them some Cokes or crackers or whatever. And once when I was here, one of the prisoners asked us for a pair of scissors to cut his hair. And we brought him a pair of scissors. Well, he cut his hair and he gave the scissors back. But anyway, we really got to chew it out. I was about 9 years old, I think, then. But he was in prison for murdering, putting poison in a well. He'd been here for years. But it could have been somebody that could have stabbed us or grabbed us.
Well, when I was a teenager, like 13, 14, 15, too young to date, anyway, I grew up on Main Street here, and so did some of my closest friends. And on Friday or Saturday nights, you know, there would be nothing to do, maybe a movie if we wanted to see it. And then we would come down here to the grassy area with nothing to do, of course, and just lollygagging around. And of course, we saw some of the prisoners sticking their heads out, or, you know, we could see them. We would just talk to them. Well, that was our entertainment for, you know, some of the time. And of course, like I said, Daddy was real good friends with Virgil Bledsoe, and I was good friends with Jan, his daughter, and my brothers and sisters and I would come down here and play and spend the night and just have a grand old time. So it's like old home to me. There comes my husband. And Tony?
Okay. Jimmy, do you want me to take you upstairs and let you do the upstairs, and then you come back down and film the exhibits as you want? Okay. Caught by a man was caught by Harvey Height, and we saw his grave earlier, and that's his friend Oni Davis standing on the turtle's back. But this is this turtle, and he caught it out of the river years ago, and that's the turtle. But he's been here a while. He's on loan. Uncle Harvey's nephew, Alan Hyatt, has loaned it to the museum and he can take it back when he wants it, but he's already told me that he intends to leave it here, but that's the turtle. And I will point out, at the Georgia Capitol, when you go to Atlanta, they have an exhibit in the science wing of the museum of a two-headed snake that was found in the Central Hatchie Creek, and that's a picture of that snake. But the actual snake is on display in Atlanta. All right, we'll go upstairs now. It's a little warm up here because there's no air conditioning, so it's warm. Wait the fuck, get up. Okay, this is the incarceration area, and the first thing that you'll probably notice when you walk upstairs is the hangman's noose. This was a functioning execution device, and I'm going to let everyone else come upstairs so they can see and hear.
I don't know if anybody else is coming up right now.
Okay, this noose was never used. It was a functioning execution device, and the whole premise was the prisoner would put their head in the noose, and there is a lever over here on the side, and these doors are now welded shut, but the person, whoever was doing the execution, would pull the handle, the prisoner would drop through, and the neck would be broken. But it was never used. Any public executions were done outside, but it was functioning if they ever wanted to do an execution in-house, but it was never done. And these are some displays about illegal executions that were done in Hurt County. This bench over here was from the Eden Grove Baptist Church, and that is where Robert Gladney's infant son is buried, is at Eden Grove, but that came from that church. This is a display on the sheriffs of Hurt County. The first two here on the corner, Robert McLipford and William White, did not serve in this building. They were before 1912. But the rest of these sheriffs all lived in this building one time or another. Now, the middle one on the bottom is Mr. Lonnie Adams, and we mentioned him earlier at the cemetery. And he's not buried at Central Hatchie, he's buried at Franklin City Cemetery. And that is Miss Sharon Frost's grandfather. And what happened is, did I talk about the sheriff earlier? I did. Okay. I'm blabbering. But anyway, I will tell it again. Mr. Hugh Goodson was the sheriff, and he discovered he could make more money being a security guard for the mill, so he resigned as sheriff to go work in the mill. And at the coroner at the time, who was the chief law enforcement officer in the absence of the sheriff, appointed Uncle Lonnie, who was the police chief of Franklin, to sleep in the jail and stay in the jail long enough for there to be a special election. And Ezra Gladney was the only candidate, and he won by default. And he also won in 1944 to serve a 4-year term. And then in 1948, he was defeated by Virgil Bledsoe, and Virgil was sheriff for 30 years from that point. Now we're going to go take a look at the cells. This was the women's cell. If they had a woman prisoner, she would be housed here. Now, if you'll come in here, what they would do is, if there was a woman in here, they would use this shield here to dress behind, and they'd scoot it over or move it around. Because depending on what angle that they were standing in, you could look right through the window or right through the door and see someone changing, so they would use this as a shield. And this cell would sleep two. They would also use this if they had a male prisoner who was unruly. They would use this as a solitary cell, because they didn't have what they call the hole here. But all of these were functioning bunks, and this one would sleep two.
I don't guess anyone ever broke out of here.
They did, actually. We're going to discuss that. It was not as successful. Ultimately, he was captured, but someone did break out.
Remember that one?
All right, we're going to come see our friend the mannequin. But this is the way the cells would be made up.
Now these cells would sleep 4 if needed. The entire jail would sleep 18 inmates, 2 in the ladies' room and 16 in this wing.